Good day, listeners, and welcome to Beyond the Checkbox, where you learn how to integrate more mental wellness into your organization through frontline leaders. I'm your host, Ryan Todd, and today we are joined by Wendy Poirier, who has recently been appointed to being the global well-being leader for one of the largest consulting firms in the world, and that firm, of course, is Willis Towers Watson. And we are very pleased to be joined by you today, Wendy, and thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So, Wendy, tell us a little bit about how you got here. I mean, you've been in mental health for a number of years. You've worked for Willis Towers Watson for a number of years. You've been consulting. How does one become a global well-being leader?
Oh, it's a long and windy road for sure. I think like with a lot of people or most people in my industry, we don't actually, we don't sort of wake up in high school one day and decide, that we're going to get into employee benefits consulting. It just kind of happens. And with me, it was probably a windy road that kind of went through a couple of different disciplines, at university. I am the product of two teachers. My father and mother were both teachers, and I saw them both very, very moved by changing kids' lives. And so I think that I wanted to take that same path. And so I went into education, but pretty quickly learned, through some practicums and such, that maybe sitting in the classroom wasn't going to be the best way for me to use my talents, and decided to get more into linguistics. Actually, is what I ended up getting a degree in, which a lot of people don't understand what linguistics is. That usually prompts the question, "Oh, how many languages do you speak?"
Yes.
Which is actually only one. I speak some French. It's a bit rusty, but really linguistics is the study of language and of communication. And I was really quite interested in speech and language pathology and working with autistic kids and communication disorders, and then kind of got more interested broadly in communication strategy, a little bit of sociology, mass communication and stuff like that. And then, because I have a little bit of that ADD, as you could probably figure out already, I thought, I kind of like the business world. It seems like an interesting place to be. So maybe a long story short, I ended up graduating on an off sort of season, right? I graduated in December instead of May, and I had some time to blow before I decided to go to a master's program in linguistics. I ended up working for the cousin of my father in an insurance agency of all places. And he kind of approached me to say, "Hey, I want to take a break. I want somebody to run my agency and my business. So would you be able to do that for a few months?" And at the time, I think my primary source of income was from teaching aerobics, because I was a big aerobics instructor back then, if you can imagine that. So I said, sure, it would be an interesting gig. I'd get to see the business world. And as he sort of left the door on his vacation to, I think he was going to South Africa, he said, "By the way, if you get your licenses, you could get the commission. I'd share the commission with you." And the licenses were, to sell home and auto insurance, individual life insurance, and then employee benefits insurance. So I took all of the licensing, I got all the requisite requirements, and started working in this agency. And as many things come to pass with sort of the right supports, I had a mentor and a coach on the employee benefit side who, I was starting to do work with companies on their renewals and helping them sort through their work with insurance companies. And she said, "This is really a great area, for women in particular." She thought that the employee benefits field was a good place for women to be successful. And it was interesting work. It was about how to help employers to provide, much needed benefits to employees. And so that kind of piqued my interest. And so that's how I started in the employee benefits world to begin with. And then landed at Willis Towers Watson in 1995. And one of the reasons I went to Willis Towers Watson was because they were doing a lot more work around employee health, what we called total health management back in the day, the precursor to well-being, I guess. So total health management was about really going beyond just the physical health realm and how, employers could support employees, with other things like mental health or wellness at the time. Well, wellness is probably the word we used more frequently. So yeah, that was 1995. I ran the health benefit practice for Willis Towers Watson in Canada for about a dozen years, and then decided more recently that I wanted to focus more on my time, and because I also saw the real opening from an employer perspective, that employers were really kind of getting the religion around well-being, and I thought this was the moment that I could spend a lot more of my time and energy and attention working with clients on the well-being side. So yeah, that's kind of led me to this opportunity to move. And I think before this, I was really focused on Canada and the U.S., primarily Canada. And this opportunity is really to take that to a broader audience, to work with some of the world's biggest companies, biggest multinationals in all sorts of industries, and help them in their journey to develop and deploy well-being strategies for their employees.
And is it just more countries, or is it more everything? More verticals, more size, bigger companies, bigger? Bigger, bigger,
bigger and more complex. So, these days I get questions, from global multinationals about how do I, particularly with the pandemic, right? That's really kind of certainly, made a lot of global companies look to providing some immediate supports to clients, so the questions I'll get on a fairly daily basis, or how do I stand up an EAP program and, for 100,000 employees in 60 countries and 17 languages, right? That's kind of the complexity of the problems. So yeah, lots of fun, lots of challenge.
Yeah. Are you working with fewer clients now, but they're bigger? Or do you have a bigger team working with you? How do you service these enormous global multinationals?
Yeah, so we have, a structure where there's, global consultants or international consultants, sometimes we call them, that work with organizations, multinationals, and then we have the in-country consultants that work with our clients locally. So it's really a mix of both. There's not actually a whole lot of people that do global well-being sort of at a high level strategic kind of consulting. And so, I'm certainly cultivating more of those people across the globe. I have a core group of those people right now that support and help support clients, but it's certainly a growing field. We have lots of sort of well-being specialists within North America, and particularly in the US. And a lot of those specialists have been working in that domain from a physical perspective for a long time. And so really expanding it into emotional well-being and financial well-being and social well-being has been, a journey that we've been on for at least a couple of years in North America.
Is there fewer consultants and fewer resource available outside, like in Europe or Asia, or is it more concentrated in North America?
I'd say that it's probably more mature in North America, if that's the right word. I think, particularly in the U.S., where the physical health aspect of what employers do is so big. I mean, it's costly, it's important, it's the primary source, right, of care. And so employers have been, in that space deeply for a long time. And so we've had our own set of, we have a lot of different clinicians. We have doctors and nurses. We have clinical psychologists. We have actuaries, a lot of actuaries to help clients, with those sort of complicated programs and policies and such around physical well-being. And I think that that's just led, to a quicker adoption of employers getting involved in broader well-being. So it's not that well-being is not important across the globe, because it is, but it's so culturally diverse in terms of what the employer's role is in well-being, right? So financial well-being is a really big thing right now, right? We know financial well-being is a huge source of stress in the normal time, and in these sort of this crisis time, it's become even more elevated. But as an example, in Asia, it's not something that we talk about a lot as an employer to an employee, right? It's more of the government, the government's job, to be there. But we're seeing movement there. We're seeing, because financial well-being is something that employers talk to employees about a lot and support them with across the whole spectrum of need. Those companies that are headquartered in Asia are seeing that and wanting to sort of support their employees like they see other organizations doing. So a lot of cultural stuff comes up with well-being, I would say, in terms of who employees look to for support, or and what types of support they look for.
And have you seen, like, now you're getting a more an enormously macro perspective. I want to talk pre-COVID, and then we can get into the COVID. But what were some of the major shifts you were seeing in your industry globally pre-COVID? Like, what was happening in that well-being space that was surprising you or shocking you, or that was just different?
Delighting me? How about delighting me?
Delighting?
Because I was being delighted by the interest in mental health. Actually, that's really, I'd say, has been the biggest shift, again, away from just physical well-being, which everybody's kind of been into, again, for a long time in the US and other parts of the world. But I was getting a lot of interest and requests to talk about global mental health and how do I support my employees from a mental health perspective. And we do a ton of research, as I'm sure you know, and we've been seeing the stress and mental health issues in that research, high up from an employee perspective. We run a study called the Global Benefit Attitude Survey, and it's global, and it's really focused on what employees are feeling and thinking and looking for from their employer. And that survey, for years, like at least the last 5 years, has shown that stress is the number one employee issue, and yet we've stuck our head in the sand. And I would say, this has been a big thing in the US. It's like, okay, it's there, but the next one must be physical well-being. So we'll look at physical well-being. But I think the message has come across loud and clear globally that mental health is a big issue. And employers are finally saying, okay, I get it. I understand it. And I understand that we have a role to play as an employer to support employees with better mental health. So that's been, what's been delightful in terms of the sort of the trend from a well-being perspective.
Do you think it's because of, I guess, why? Like, is it because it's a cost issue? Is it trendy? Is there thought leaders that are pushing it? Why the shift?
Well, I mean, we could, from a Canadian perspective, we could certainly talk about the shift that we've seen with, more involvement from governments and large corporations to support employees with mental health. That's not universal, for sure. I think, if the question is about why employers are looking at it, I think employers take their role as, as being a provider of services to support employees. We often talk about the employee experience, right? The employee experience is something that employers are all trying to really get their head around, making sure that employees have a good experience, that the experience they have working with that organization is positive, so that they're engaged. And so that leads to productivity, that leads to good business results. So they stay, so they can attract people, so they can support their goals and their visions, around, creating a purposeful organization. So we've seen lots of that sort of, it's not just about the shareholder as the stakeholder, it's about employees being stakeholders. So I think a lot of what I've seen, in Canada, I always used to say that it was kind of nice to be in an environment where it was more of an altruistic, opportunity for employers to be involved in health, whether that's physical or otherwise. But I'd say nowadays, most organizations really do want to do the right thing by employees. They want to support their employees. They want to see them healthy.
That's across the board, not just in Canada.
Yes. Yep.
Oh, that's good. That's surprising to me, I guess, from a global perspective. Not that like humans aren't good humans globally, but that the value systems across the globe in terms of how you treat those who work for you are merging into a place of maybe more altruism, or maybe, more recognizing loyalty and purpose. Like those seem to be, I don't know, Western notions sometimes, whether they're good or bad. But it's interesting to see that those are carried out throughout the entire globe right now, is what you're seeing.
Yep, I would say that's pretty universally true. I don't know if you ever pay much attention to sort of Larry Fink's letter to shareholders. He's very forward about the S and ESG being one of the most important parts of what organizations can look at. And that's probably more of a North American / European sort of concept. But I think I've seen it a lot in Asian companies, or South American. So yeah, I think it's pretty universal. I think it's growing. I think that's that's the part that gives me hope, gives me
Yeah.
a delight. That is absolutely a growing feature. And it's not every company for sure, but we're dealing with sort of the largest sort of global multinational companies, and they all, I think, have investors, and those investors want to see that they're treating all their stakeholders well. So I think that's grown a lot in the last 3 to 5 years for sure.
Have you seen other cultural differences, that you think are positive or negative when you're working in, Asia, Europe? Have you seen major differences in the way that we're approaching even mental health or physical health or well-being? Like, are there things there that have surprised or delighted you now that you're taking that global role?
Yeah, it might be a bit early days for me to have a real deep understanding of some of those other countries. I think, you know, uh, just the general desire to be innovative and creative and to meet employees where they are. I think that's been again a focus. So we often, when we talk about designing programs or practices, we've often done it from a real high level. We get a group of experts together and we talk about what we think employees need or want, and we use research, et cetera. And I think the fairly universal practice these days is to say, well, let's step back and actually look at this from an employee view and look at personas. So what kind of personas do we have? And what do those people need along their journey? So that might vary by this life stage that they're at, by their particular needs, any time in their career, what their family's going through, all that kind of stuff. So I think I've seen a lot more interest, again, pretty universally, around trying to, from a value perspective, getting rid of low value programs and practices and really focusing on high value and determining that value based on the employee's particular needs at any point in time in their journey. So that's been
That's a really interesting concept, is high and low value in wellness. Because, from my perspective, wellness is one of those things that leaders can put forth merely to improve their brand or to communicate that we love you and you should stay. And I think there is some value there, but that's probably lower on the value chain. Higher on the value chain are like actual outcome-based, measurable practices that are evidence-based. And then you're talking about designing programs with groups that are all, they're in 60 different countries. How do you gather personas and get to the bottom of what people need in 60 different countries? Like, how do you even approach that?
Yes. Well, again, we often pull in our research. So we've done this great deal of research already globally, around benefit attitudes that employees have. So that's usually our first step, is to say, okay, and often global countries, don't get me wrong, they don't always go at something with 60 different countries. They'll say, let's try this. Let's talk about, as an example, let's talk about leave policies. A lot of global organizations are interested in meeting employees' needs around caregiving, whether that's childcare or elder care, surrogacy, adoption, things like that. Those are also some really fantastic trends that I've seen across the globe. And that gets pretty complicated pretty quickly, right? So instead of maybe going after all 60 countries that they're in, let's look at our top 10, where we might have 1,000 employees or more. And let's focus on those top 10. And then it's, doing a deep dive. It's lots of Excel spreadsheets. It's lots of finding the right practices, and then taking that to their, putting that sort of across the subset of employee attitudes to say, okay, so if our demographic and our employees look like this X group, what does this X group, based on our research, say that is important to them? And then we actually just sit down and we work it out in workshops to say, if these are the top 3 or 4 or 5 personas that you have in your organization, and these are their needs, then how do we meet them? How do we meet them through their, emotional, financial, social, and physical well-being needs? So it's a process for sure. And it's one that's kind of based on, using the research, using, some analytic capabilities around getting those personas lined up, and then really just working out persona by persona what that looks like in each of the different countries.
That sounds in depth, and like you said, it takes some time. What happens when, okay, let's talk pre-COVID, when a CEO says we need this, and you have like, and I'm sure there's examples in mental health. They're like, we need a mental health program now, and I'm imagining that's happening a lot during COVID. Like, we need something now, and we need it everywhere. We don't have time to design personas and grassroots this and workshop it. How do you evaluate, and how does that chain of, decision making happen?
Yeah, no, that's certainly been the number one question with post or into the COVID crisis, was how do we stand up mental health, some sort of mental health support for employees, and that's that typically goes right to an EAP vendor, which is somewhat reactive, but hey, we're in a reactive place. So how does it happen? I think again, we're pretty analytic. So having experience and understanding of the global EAP market, putting that across what the employer thinks is important. I mean, EAP companies, like any other sort of solution, they have different focuses, different strengths or different weaknesses. How do they want to use this EAP program in the context of a broader mental health program? What do they have for a broader mental health program, right? I think that those are also the questions we ask. And then some days it's just get us this EAP, just stand it up. The EAP companies have been very very innovative for the moment in terms of providing things, services that are tailored to the COVID crisis, so almost like their critical incident stress, management programs. When you have an incident, they've developed an EAP type product that, you could put in place within, 24 hours across X number of countries that would serve a certain purpose, right, and a certain immediate need. Yeah. Particularly in countries that might not have that sort of, backdrop as, in a public healthcare setting. So yeah, I mean, it varies, but there's like that. We've done some of that immediate need setup for the critical incident, and then we've just been doing quite a lot of work around standing up an EAP program, to fill the gaps in countries where it wasn't there. And then, along with that, I think as companies are sort of getting into the restoring stability phase, we know we're not always, we're not completely in the crisis stage. We're talking about, okay, so if that's just one aspect of the mental health or emotional well-being programs, what's missing? What's next? What do we need to put in place to support employees? We still need to address stigma in a lot of countries. We still need to, support employees with building resilience. So that's kind of the next generation of conversation. I'd say I'm having a few of those right now, but certainly employers are thinking.
Yeah, and that's where are the gaps? Where do you see the downfalls? The EAPs are really good for some things, not great for others. Where do you see the white space, or are all the solutions in existence and we just need to somehow get them to everyone?
Yeah, there's maybe a bit of both. I'd say, because there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of stuff being developed. There's a lot of really great, solutions. I think that one of the big gaps I still see is that training and support and empowering for leaders and managers. I think that's a way to design and deliver that, specific to a company's needs quickly, effectively. The mental health first aid training, I'm sure you're familiar with that. It's been sort of one of the sort of stopgaps, I guess, for companies in certain countries that where it's in Canada, the US, the UK. It provides a pretty good training program, but again, it's not necessarily very leverageable, and it's not as complete maybe as I think it could be or should be. So,
What do you mean leverageable?
well, it's done by you've got to for the truly do the mental health training, you have to have the credentials from that body, whether it's like in
Yes.
Canada, the UK, right, or the US or Australia. So it's not in every country. It's something that not everybody gets accredited. So you don't have the curriculum if you're not accredited, things like that. So it's not as leverageable as.
Tough for big companies.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
Yeah.
So I think that's still a bit of a gap. I still see white space there. I mean, we do lots of that. Well, we do quite a bit of that for companies specific, to their circumstances, but it's not something that's easily accessible by every company, right? It's not every company has that sort of resource to put it to tailor, that type of training to their managers and leaders. And by the way, like in the whole crisis, it was just not there. Like the whole idea of communicating and getting that information to managers and leaders just in time, it failed. I think that was probably one of the biggest failures. And so we then had to sort of rely or fall back on training that managers had already. But talking to employees about mental health is not an easy thing, right? It's not something maybe you do it every day. You're pretty well versed in how to talk to employees about, or people generally, about mental health issues, but that's not something that's easy to do for a lot of managers. So
Where do you think the industry needs to go, or where do you see it just naturally progressing in innovation to be able to meet those needs? Is it just a technology thing? Is it a paradigm shift in how we approach that gap and that white space? Where do you see things going?
Yeah, it could certainly be a technology enabled resource, right? So again, back to the EAP model, that's something that they've done, as a course, of their regular services, provided sort of manager training. It's often very poorly attended. It's
Why is
often,
that, do you think?
well, and maybe it'll get better after this crisis. Well, all those reasons that people have for not attending, sort of virtual sessions or in-person sessions, not enough time, not enough interest, right? It's got to be a priority. It's got to be something that an employer puts a priority on. And it's not always that compelling. Again, a vastly different experience between, one EAP and another, or between one trainer and another. So it's not always been a great experience. So that's sort of one thing. But I think this pandemic crisis has sort of elevated employers' understanding of the need to have better support for managers and leaders. And I think there's great point solutions again that have been focused more on the employee and building their resilience, less on sort of the manager training aspect of it. So I think that's certainly an opportunity. I've seen a bit more of that coming up in some of the review I've done of some of the new point solutions available in the marketplace.
What's a point solution?
Well, point solution, I would define a point solution as, say something that you do, right? I'd call Headversity a point solution to support, resilience. It's like a vendor that provides a solution that's very tailored to one element. So an insurance company provides services across a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
Most of the insurance companies have actually started adopting point solutions, right? So you'll see, the big insurers all making partnerships with, different, either an EAP could be a point solution, or a telehealth vendor, or mental health vendor.
You have a need. We need a vendor to provide a service. Okay. That's it. Yeah, and you brought up something interesting about, sometimes it's just not that compelling. And you've seen what has worked and what hasn't longitudinally and over, a lot of different companies. What makes it compelling? Like what can the industry do to make mental health messaging, mental health training more compelling so people do attend and show up? What do you think needs to happen there? It's $1 million question, really.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about who delivers it and how it's delivered, and making it impactful and meaningful and real to you. So doing it in a way that can draw people out and get them engaged and sharing and feeling it, that it sort of sells the whole idea of mental health is important. And I've seen that. those aha moments. It's akin to like biometric screenings, right? Like employers were always like, oh, biometric screenings, I'm not sure I want to do that. And then they'll have that one person who finds out, that they had some disease that they could then get treated and, get immediate, value. They see the value right away. I'd say the same as with managers, right? Like if managers can sort of get into understanding how they can manage themselves, as, emotional intelligence, how to manage their own, build their own resilience, have their own purpose, their own story, their own brand, right? Like if you can sort of relate to a manager as an employee first, and then get them understanding that they too could support employees in a better way to manage their own mental health. So I think it's a sort of a layered approach, right? It's like addressing the person as a person, and then getting them to understand how they can then support other employees. So, getting them to buy into it is the big part of it. So if you can get them to buy into it, then I think it's successful.
In particular, leaders and managers buying into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, has that changed, like the ability to make a compelling message? Has that changed during COVID? We've seen a shift in the last 6 weeks in North America. That's kind of when North American companies went on isolation. What has shifted there for you? Has it become more compelling? Where are the needs? What's the big shift during COVID have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things have shifted. I mean, I think the understanding of a need for all the, what we call pillars of well-being to be supported, and of course in a virtual way. I think, there's the idea that how employers communicate and react, of course, this is like a defining leadership moment for everybody. And so staying true to their purpose and values has been, I think it's been great. I mean, it's been really interesting to see how companies have done that, have risen to that challenge. But it's also about sort of creating trust with employees. So speaking to them, with authenticity, with being straightforward but thoughtful about how you communicate to employees, how you balance, right? This is a big balancing act between employee well-being and business well-being. So there's just been so many like very concentrated opportunities for employers to send messages that are again are pretty defining right now. I think that's been a really big shift, right? Even if an employer, or a big company wanted to, and we've certainly supported and helped lots of organizations recreate their brand or their brand with employees. But this is like the moment that it's been really important for them to come out with that balanced approach, that we totally want to keep you safe and healthy and protect your well-being, your financial, your social, your emotional, and your physical well-being. And we also, understand that we need to do something for our business. So maybe that means furloughs or layoffs, and how do you communicate those kinds of things in a compassionate or empathetic way?
That's an incredible challenge, and I don't think I've seen leaders under such duress as we've seen them in the last 6 weeks, trying to communicate very difficult, complicated messages around layoffs and temporary layoffs, and trying to do what's best for the company and trying to create something so that it exists when you come back, and also dealing with the ambiguity of it all. Like a lot of leaders, like nobody knows when this is really going to end. I think there's more optimism now, but nobody knows when the pandemic's going to be over, when the curve will be flattened, if there's going to be a second wave of things, and how do we deal with that second wave? So yeah, that's right. I see the like mental health piece kind of falling apart for individual employees because there's so much gray zone now. And I think we just tolerate gray zones so poorly. It's just not part of our infrastructure in our brain is to tolerate that gray zone. Are you helping leaders communicate? Like, are you giving scripts? Are you talking about brand? Is that something that your group actually consults on?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we've done a lot of, like, we did some pretty immediate like well-being tips for employees that employers could put out, 10 different languages. It was kind of fun across the 4 pillars. And would continue to help employers with that. A lot of employers have HR sites or microsites, or maybe they're using sort of a virtual, um, some sort of technology platform to get out particularly well-being messages, or that they already have well-being content on. So yeah, that's a lot of what we've been doing for sure, supporting employers around that messaging and how to get that messaging right, and how to make sure that it's touching on all the right points. A lot of the work we're doing too is really to just sort of curate solutions around things like time off or leaves or furloughs, or how to make that work. Again, what we've seen is that employers are trying their hardest not to reduce benefits or things like that, but there's just some things that have to be done, right? And so how do you do that in a really, again, a compassionate way?
Yeah, I think that's the other the other force that's at play here is like a lot of the finances of these organizations are crumbling, and this is the time to put in more benefits. How are you navigating that? Like, a lot of companies aren't able to pay for what they used to be able to pay for, and they need it the most right now. How are you messaging around that? What are you talking about? How are those conversations going?
Yeah, it does kind of come back to value. And so what are where are the places where we could, take something away in order to make sure that we can pay for the stuff that's important and that's really valuable right now? So, I mean, it's sort of a case by case sort of play.
Are you seeing things being taken away so mental health supports can be put in place?
I've seen, well, so we've seen, for instance, organizations look at how they could support employees more financially, but taking, contemplating things that they maybe are contributing to right now that are not going to be helpful right away, but they'd rather put them in other places. So, is it important for them to continue a contribution to a certain savings plan or a DC plan, or is there some fat in some of the perquisites that are there? Or maybe there was just the perquisites aren't there anymore, right? Like if you shut down your childcare facility, you're no longer you don't have that expense. So could we move it somewhere else? So for Canadian employers, that was like the dental programs. Well, nobody's getting dental services anymore, right? So there's a savings, right? How can we want to make sure we factor that into what we're going to do in anything else? But yeah, I mean, I'd say for sure I've seen that employers are not taking anything away on the mental health side, which is great, right? Because I think we've seen other ups and downs in economic cycles that sometimes, it's just a wide swath of cutting. But I think there's been a lot of very careful, consideration that they don't want to touch anything that has to do with the mental health support.
Have you seen or experienced anything like this in your experience? Like have you has there been other crises that even come close to what we're dealing with now?
No, that's an easy question. No.
Yeah.
And I've been through a lot of ups and downs of the oil and gas sector, right? So we've seen, when the barrel of oil went from 100 to 50, that was a pretty big crisis to get through in, that industry sector. So yeah, but that's nothing like what's happening today. And it's so narrow. It was so narrowly focused, right?
Yeah. And I don't think there will ever be, maybe who knows, but I don't think there ever has been so much attention on mental health as the result of a crisis. And have you ever seen such a dramatic shift toward shining a light on mental health resources and things?
Yeah, no, this is kind of it. I think as the opioid crisis was really kind of heating up, we saw for sure some more interest around how do we manage that and how that comes back to mental health issues. Of late, suicide rates have increased. We've seen huge levels of anxiety with the millennials. Like, those are all sort of small, little incremental things that I think, again, we're sort of building to that. Like, it wasn't just that these organizations were looking at developing global mental health strategies, for no reason before the pandemic. There was lots of those things building up that were sort of weighing on employers' minds and saying, yeah, we need to look at this more seriously. Like I said, stress has been the number one issue for years in the employee data. And it's finally just sort of come to a head with employers that, it's time to do something about it. But yeah, this pandemic has really pushed everything very much more forward, more quickly.
And has that shift also been toward digital? The statistics on how everything is moving digital, from HR platforms to obviously communication platforms to just everything has needed to move digital. Have you seen that shift in mental health offerings and point solutions too?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. It was a big shift before, and now it's again just been accelerated, I think.
Yeah.
Um, Digital, technology, AI, still how AI can play a role in that is still sort of coming to the forefront. I mean, even beyond mental health, certainly the whole shift into robotics and such is been accelerated with the pandemic.
Wendy, you're a very busy person, and you are connected in a way that very few people are, and that's got to be stressful at times. How are you managing your mental, physical, emotional health? What's the fourth pillar? Financial. How are you? Staying well during this time?
Well, I'm still employed, so that's managed.
That's no check. Well, that's one pillar done.
That was an easy check. Yeah, so lots of different ways, I guess. That prolonged winter that we had was certainly putting a real strain on on the physical and emotional well-being for sure. But now that it's nice out, I'm on my bikes. I got a road bike and a mountain bike, and I'm riding my horses out here on the ranch, which is kind of nice, getting out into the sunshine, reading a lot more books, playing board games, all sorts of strategies there.
Excellent. Well, I learned a lot today, as I do every time you can spare some moments with us. And so we really appreciate you being on the show. I was most interested to hear about this transformation pre-COVID that you have been a part of, but also have provided a lot of thought leadership toward. And then this acceleration, this gas pedal that's been stepped on to accelerate the digital transformation, the HR transformation, shining a light on mental health. And your global perspective is invaluable at a time like this. So thank you very much for joining us today. And we would love to have more conversations with you about, the global perspective when all the dust settles.
Right. And when I can actually get on a plane and travel to some global places and really experience.
Yeah, and actually be global. Yeah. That would be great. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us today, listeners. And I am your host, Ryan Todd, and this is Beyond the Checkbox. Today we are joined by Wendy Poirier, who is the global wellness leader for one of the biggest consulting firms in the world, Willis Towers Watson. And thank you, Wendy, for sharing your time with us today.
You're welcome.